So this session we're going to be talking about the English language paper 1, but specifically we're going to be focusing on question 1, and that's of course to do with the first assessment objective. If we look at the assessment objective, it actually looks quite complicated. There's a number of different skills here that they're asking you to do. What's important for question 1 on paper 1 is that you don't have to do all of these things for this question, because it's only worth 4 marks, and so you should only be spending 5 minutes on it. What's important here is the first line, identifying and interpreting explicit information. So this question is just asking you to find the information that's there on the surface. It doesn't require you to dig underneath, it doesn't require you to use your implicit information. What is there? And the second part is asking you to select and synthesize evidence from different texts. And all that simply means is finding the right quotation and putting it in the right box. It couldn't be simpler. The problem with this question is that some students, particularly those students that find English easier, have a habit of trying to look deeper into this question, and actually those students are wasting time. You need to find it quickly and get it down on the paper. One important thing to remember before we tackle this question is you have to read the whole passage before you read any of the questions. And the reason we have to do that is because if you don't read the whole passage, first of all, you're going to lose the whole meaning of what's actually happening. People get into this habit of just looking for the questions, looking for the answers for these questions, and they become blinkered to actually what's really going on. And that's actually where you find students making some really big and silly mistakes because they haven't actually understood what's going on in the whole passage. So, one important rule here is read the passage before you look at the questions. So here's a typical question that you would get on the exam, and it's actually taken from the Jamaica In paper, the first paper that AQA released. You can find this paper on the AQA website, and it's in the shared area for students to download and use it for revision. Let's have a quick look at this question first of all, because there's actually quite a lot of information here that we need to make sure we get right. And the first thing is, you are always going to be told what lines to look for. In this case, you're asked to look between lines 1 to 7. If you answer or take any of your answers from any part of the source outside of those lines, you will not be awarded any marks. So it's very important that you get the right part of the passage. The second thing to note is, as you can see, that the word for has been put in bold, and that is because you do need to have 4 things from this part of the text. What's important here though is that if a student is to write 2 of their ideas in A and they get it right, they can actually get both of them right. And that's important because some students may have got the first A, B, C correct, but they get D wrong. That doesn't mean that you'll only get 3 out of 4. If a student has written in 2 answers correctly in A and got D incorrect, they can still get 4 out of 4. However, obviously it doesn't mean that if you write 5 correct answers you'll get 5 out of 4. I'll show you what I mean more by that when we look at the passage in more detail in a moment. The other thing that's really important about this text, about this question, is that you've got to look at the weather in Cornwall. And this is really important because this is really showing you your focus of what you need to do in the exam. You must get this bit right. If you look at the wrong thing, you will lose all your marks. So when we look at the passage on the next slide, we're only looking for things that do directly to do with the weather. You can also see that this question is worth 4 marks. And again, the marks give you an indication of how long you should be spending on the passage and the question. You should only be spending 5 minutes maximum answering this question. And finally, you can see you have there 4 spaces to write your answers in, about 2 lines. My advice is to always use direct quotations. It's quicker, it's easier, it will save you a lot of time. One thing to note, some students that I've been teaching in the past do this question very quickly. They do this question in 2 to 3 minutes. And that's absolutely fine, particularly if you want to use that time elsewhere. Just remember, you have got 5 minutes. Make sure you read over your answers to make sure you're completely happy with them. It will be a disaster if you lose 1 or 2 marks on such an easy question. So this is the passage taken from the exam. It's quite straightforward, and what I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to stop the recording and I'd like you to look for anything that's to do with the weather and write them down. So stop the recording now. Okay, so what I've done here is actually not looked at the correct answers. What I've done here on purpose is look at some of the incorrect answers that students make. The first one, and a number of my students actually did this in their exam, was to pick out the fact that it was late November, and that's also linked with students picking out winter evening. On reflection, talking to the students about this, Their answer to me was, it's November, it's winter, so it's going to be cold, and of course that's correct. However, what they've done is they've looked too deeply into this question. It's not directly to do with the weather. It's both about the season and the month, and so because of that it can't be awarded any marks. So it's about keeping things simple and not overcomplicating them. The same goes for the third thing that I've highlighted there. It would be dark by 4. Darkness has nothing to do with the weather, but I've seen it on a number of exams. The last two things I've highlighted have been picked up by a few students, but hopefully they should be fairly obvious about why they're wrong. The leather seats felt damp, and the smudging the leather and leaving a dark blue stain like a splodge of ink. These are effects of the weather and what the weather has done, but they're not about the weather itself and what's doing with the weather. So these are obvious mistakes, and you can see on every paper that there's always a few things that may be right, they could be wrong. My advice to you is there's always going to be easier points to find. So if you're unsure about something, leave it to one side and look for other things. And if you can't find it, then use it. So what I've done here is I've highlighted myself what I think would be the correct responses. So I've tried to think about everything that's to do with the weather, and some of them have repeated themselves, but the idea is I've highlighted as much as I could, and then I can make a decision what I'm going to put in and what I'm not going to put in. So the first thing is it was a cold day, and actually when we look at the mark scheme in a moment you can see that it's simply a cold day gets you a mark. We find that the weather had changed overnight. There was a wind, there was a granite sky and a mizzling rain. There is a mist, the air was clammy and cold, and there are drips of rain. All of these are very simple, they're very straightforward, and all I would do is once I've highlighted them, I would choose 4 of these to put into the mark scheme. Now what's interesting is when we look at the mark scheme in a moment, if a student was to write clammy cold in A, they would actually be awarded 2 marks for that, because clammy and cold are separate marks on the mark scheme. That means that if you did get one wrong later on, you could still get 4 marks out of 4. Let's have a look at the mark scheme. So on the indicative content, candidates may include it was a cold day, the weather had changed overnight, there was a wind, there was a mist on the hills, the air was clammy, the air was cold, and it was raining. So they're pretty straightforward. And as you can see, the examiner can also other valid responses that you're able to verify by checking the source. However, I highlighted pretty much everything that was to do with the weather on that question, and there's little argument as there's to be in anything else on there. So it's quite straightforward. So I'd like you to give this one a go again. This is from the Brighton Rock paper. Some of you would have done this in class. And I'd like you to have a look at the question there. It says read again the first part of the source, lines 1 to 3, so it's very short. And I'd like you to list 4 things from this part of the source about hail. So it's very specific, but you have to find 4 things, but in a much shorter space of time. So here is the passage. I'd like you to stop the recording, give yourself 5 minutes, and write me down 4 things that we learn about hail. So how did you do? This is the mark scheme. There's obviously fewer things on this mark scheme because it was a much shorter passage that they've chosen, but again there was actually quite a lot there, and there's very little that students wouldn't be able to put down. First of all, he knew he was going to be murdered. He is in Brighton, which is actually one of the most obvious ones, but lots of students skipped over it because they thought it was too obvious. He has inky fingers, he has bitter nails, and he has a cynical manner. And again, any other valid responses that we're able to verify, but to be fair, there's not much left on that passage that you would be able to pick out. Finally, if you want to have more revision for AO1 skills, and that's not just for question 1 on this paper, but it's also for question 1 and 2 on the English language paper 2, all the AO1 resources are on Go for Schools. If you download them, you can then take them off. They're structured with basic, secure, advanced and mastery. The idea is you try one, you take it to your teacher, if you get it right, you move to the next level.